All right, this is a biggie. This is a biggie indeed. Whether you love or hate Uncle Bob, Robert Martin, you should respect the fact that he is a legend in programming. Whether you can subscribe to his ideas or some of the ideas that him and his peers came up with, he's through and through a legend and should be respected for that status. This is a conversation, honestly, that I've needed to hear for a long time. Prime is clearly bringing a lot of millennial programmer pain to the man himself, to the man that came up with a lot of the ideas that were pushed on us as you know, as we started and continue to progress through our careers. So I had a lot of thoughts on it, and I wanted to jump on and do it with you guys. So let's get cracking because it's a good one.
So I think for me the most important question to ask is that in the last about I'd say in the 15-ish years, because when I went to college and when I started going to college, it was clean code, the Gang of Four, we also had Java as our primary language of.
A lot of the concepts of clean code I actually learned after college, but it was the same, similar era. You know, I'm a little bit younger than Prime, but been doing this for kind of 10, 15 years now. And yeah, it was actually after college that I learned. So I had my own Uncle Bob, but we'll continue.
Of learning programming with was a very like important part. When I would go into interviews, it was always like, all right, tell me the design patterns that you know. Can you explain this in these terms, right? Solid was brought up a lot, all that kind of stuff. But then as time has gone on, it feels like that's no longer talked about. I really don't ever hear the term design pattern ever discussed among anybody.
Which I think there is a big dichotomy between US engineers, US programmers, and UK programmers, developers. And I have to agree, there actually isn't much conversation around design patterns these days. And I'm always the one ramming it down people's throats. But I'm not sure if that's because of the origin stories of a lot of like web programmers, or whether that's just because these ideas have faded into obscurity. I don't think it's the latter.
What kind of has caused this shift? And do you think it's a direct shifting away from something like clean code, or is it just a nomenclature change among people?
What has caused the shift is what has caused that shift in the last 50 years. It's the same effect. And the effect is that the demand for programmers is so large that the number of programmers in the world doubles every 5 years or so. And there's no way to keep up with a way of thought when you've got a doubling of the number of people pouring in, right? So
it's also important to note where these people poured in from. A lot of them are pouring in from like boot camps, academies, places, institutions that will get you the minimum skills. I actually talked about a little bit in my last video, which is around frameworks and how they're kind of contributing to making you a frameworker and not like a full engineer. You know, engineering is obviously a mind state. It's a way of approaching things. But yeah, go watch that video if you haven't already. But I think the origin stories of a lot of these programmers and where that demand is, where that supply is coming from for that demand is a big bit as to why people aren't subscribing to necessarily the same schools of thought.
You might have some thought leaders from 30 years ago who had some really good ideas. Those ideas have been swept aside by the wave of people just pouring in. And it's very, very difficult to maintain any kind of consistent mode of thought when you're in that kind of demographic deluge.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
One of the things I try to do is yell loud enough so that people remember some of these things and bring them back into the present so that they can look at them and go, oh, there are these things called design patterns. Gee, I didn't know anything about that. Well, maybe you'll have to read something about that.
And I mean,
by the way,
I hope to think that, you know, a more modern medium for that would be video streams, etc. And you know, obviously Prime pre this interview had his thoughts on certain design patterns, certain parts of clean code, and maybe has either the same or different ones now. But like, I've got a relatively strong stance on at least how I feel about them, not necessarily how I subscribe to them. So anything that I kind of subscribe to, I think is helpful, useful, I will be putting out on this channel. So subscribe if you haven't already. So,
The design patterns book is probably the most important book written in the last 30 years, and it's been swept away by this wave of incoming people.
Do you think that a lot of modern software can have the same benefit with these design patterns? Because I'll tell you, like personally, I pretty much am a strategy pattern guy. Right. I think the strategy pattern really is the basis of all patterns. Right. I mean, it's pretty much life is strategy. That's pretty much just use an interface. Do you think that much beyond that knowledge and the builder pattern that there is a lot of usefulness still to continue to like dive into these patterns?
absolutely.
Oh, there's a ton of usefulness to it, because the purpose of a design pattern is to have a name on a structure. So I can say to you, well, I think we ought to use the visitor pattern.
And I think this is where a big portion of the discourse that you might see online with, the pro and the cons, the pro and the anti design patterns, or, some certain design patterns, or the implementation of certain design patterns, or the implementation of certain structural patterns for laying out. I talked about it briefly again in my video where I reacted to Theo talking about separation of concern. Separation MVC, which is a structural pattern, is an implementation of separation of concerns. It's not a thing in itself, and I think it's actually the discourse which has really muddied the water around what these things are, what their intentions are, and the benefits of them. Not necessarily can X, Y, or Z be crammed into a pre-existing framework or an application that maybe either exists or you're going out to build.
Here, and if you know what that pattern is, which you're right, it's just a bunch of strategies.
Common
but if
language.
you know what that pattern is, then that structure snaps into your mind, and you and I can have an intelligent discussion about it, and we can have a discussion of the pros and cons. Or if you're sitting there reading code and you see, oh,
so much of programming is communication, and it's completely pointless if everyone says communication's key. It's actually comprehension that's key. If you can speak all day to somebody, if they don't comprehend what you're saying, if they don't actually understand you, then it's just silent chaos. No one knows what's going on. So design patterns and having like a common understanding, a central sort of point of truth as to what we're trying to achieve, or how we're going to maybe potentially try and achieve it, goes a long way in saving time and mental gymnastics.
Oh, this is the XYZ decorator, and you happen to know the decorator pattern, then the structure snaps into your brain, and you don't have to work it out by reading the code perfectly. Right? That's the whole point of design patterns. It's a way to take one notch up on the level of abstraction, so that you can look at things in the code and identify them without having to go line by line by line by line.
Yes. Okay. No, I mean that's a very good answer.
Which is not how
because
people use
we often have a lot of data structures or algorithms. If I say, hey, this is a general tree, you already know what a general tree is, right? I don't have to explain to it that you have 0 or more children, right? Like that's just not a thought process we have to have. So therefore, you could make the argument that if we know what a builder pattern is, and I say, hey, let's use the builder pattern, you and I are both probably thinking something that's very, very close to the same thing. It may be slightly different, but for the most part, at least close to the same thing. Okay.
The implementation of the pattern might be slightly different, but the pattern largely, I think, you'd probably be thinking the same thing.
I think that's actually a pretty reasonable argument for design patterns. But one thing, can I say it this way, that a lot of times what I see is that when people kind of are really into this, because remember, Netflix was a large Java shop, was there for a long time, and so there was a lot of patterns. I often find people reaching first for a pattern and an abstraction before the problem is ever solved. What do you think about that? Because I know you're very into the design first and then program kind of approach. You said that in Casey's, here. Let me bring up your exact quote. Sorry, I did do it like a...
But I think like largely, that's an approach thing, right? It's down to the individual. It's down to how they want to go about it. And it's really subjective kind of how much planning you do before you approach something. Everyone's going to do some level of thought before they approach something, not just going at it blind.
Create the abstractions and think about the structure of your code before you start coding. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Am I correct on that one?
Yes, with caveats, but yes.
Okay. a lot of like modern, or at least what I would call modern thinking, at least like the go way of thinking, is that you kind of almost do somewhat of the opposite. That you don't reach for abstraction first. You actually try to get the thing itself first out, and you allow the abstractions to more naturally percolate or manifest themselves. How can you kind of resolve those two school of thoughts?
No, I don't think there's a resolution there. So the way I work is that I will do the most concrete thing first. I will think about the problem. The amount of thinking I do is an hour, maybe.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
maybe I'll scratch a little design on a whiteboard or something.
for me, it's exactly the same. This isn't even. I didn't even read. I haven't even read clean code. I learned a lot of Uncle Bob's concepts through my own Uncle Bob. Somebody that kind of relayed his interpretation of it, and I think somehow I've ended up thinking it very much the same way. This might be something uh, you think about while you're on your way to work, or something you think about. You can kind of conceptualize the problem. You have an understanding of how you might approach it, but in practice, how you actually go about it is actually you do the thing, you build the thing, and then when it gets to a point that hold on, yeah, I don't want to reuse code here, or I don't want to have to bind something here, then you reach for the abstraction, you reach for the don't repeat yourself business. It isn't something that's premeditated. I think anybody that's stuck within a school of thought tightly is already going down the wrong track. And I think that's not a I don't think that's what clean code's all about. I don't think that's what Bob's all about. I think it's more of a misconception of like, oh, I need to use a design pattern. Like you probably will end up using some sort of design pattern, but I think having something you might even have an idea of what might fit, but being stuck to that, I think is an inflexibility and really more of a failure of the person who's approaching it rather than the concept of the paradigm of like potentially using a pattern. We can't like kill the pattern because the idea that somebody might want to use a specific pattern, like that's just a bad argument in my opinion.
Or a piece of paper. I'll think about it, and then I will enter it. If the problem is large enough, then I will do that. And then I go right for the most concrete thing I can. And then
Okay.
I have the problem force me to become abstract.
Exactly.
As I'm adding more and more code, it starts to get harder and harder to add that code without adding an abstraction of some kind. And so I let the code force that abstraction upon me, and I continue that process. And typically, you wind up with an awful lot of abstractions once you follow that process.
Uh,
Yep.
Do you ever, knowing like, so let's say that you have like, it's hard to always come up with these examples kind of off the top of your head, but you have something that you could easily see into a series of if statements or switch statements. Like, right, you have a message type that you're going to be handed. It's a string, and the first one is just message, and then
Yep.
the next one, there will be more, but there might not be many. How do you determine when to abstract versus when to go, you know what? If there's 3 hard coded strings, I'm fine with that. Like, when do you make this decision?
Um, for me, it's a kind of feel thing. As I'm
Exactly.
working in the code, I look.
Exactly. And this may this may actually be the most important point of this part of the interview. If you're writing code and you don't get a feeling, you're not if you're writing something and you don't kind of it doesn't you don't know whether it feels right or it doesn't feel right, or you don't feel anything at all, then I don't know what advice I've got for you, but I think you need to really kind of reassess why you're doing it. Because for me, it's always been about a feeling. Like when you make a decision to go down a certain road, it's about how it feels. It's like, does that feel horrible? Is this something that might bite me later? Is it something that I may regret, or I like to be considerate for the next developer, the person coming after me? um you don't want to plan for a future that you might never have in programming. There is an element of like, okay, let's just it's effort versus reward, right? And it's flexibility versus again effort required. So you've got to make a logical decision, but it's probably based off feeling, and a lot of that feeling comes off experience. So maybe I'm wrong to say reconsider if you don't get that feeling. I think just keep doing. If you don't, that's probably the best advice I can give is if you don't get a feeling and you don't know, just keep doing. Go and build more applications. Go and solve more problems. Go and find something that you're passionate about and solve it with a piece of software, or go and write an integration, and you will soon realize when you look back at those things 2 months later, 3 months later, 6 months, a year later, they'll feel right or wrong, you know, and you'll start to build this understanding and this kind of like core, core feeling around it.
Look at it, and I get this itchy feeling in
Exactly
some
that.
part of my face or gut, and I think, oh man, that's going to kill me later on. And at some point, that's overwhelming, and then I make the abstraction. But a switch statement with 2 cases, 3 cases, I'm probably not going to get upset about.
Okay. Do you have a number that you put on it, or is it really just only feel? Like, can 5 be too many? Like, is there ever too many?
Well, I think yes, you can say 1,000 is too many, but
Agreed. Yeah.
there's no hard number, because it all depends on the context, right? If I'm putting together a program for a demonstration that I'm doing, and I'm going to throw it away, I'm just not going to worry about it very much.
Exactly.
On the other hand, if it's
the effort
for a client, and the client has a long lifetime and they're expecting to make a lot of changes to it, then I'm going to be a lot more careful.
Exactly. It's all about figuring it out. It's all about experience. And I really implore you to keep practicing, to keep diving in, keep seeing what can ignite that feeling for you, and see where you get on. I'm gonna leave this video here. There's a lot more of this interview I want to watch. I'm probably gonna split it up into other videos. If you enjoyed my take on this, consider subscribing. Like the video, it does actually really help. Trust me. And see you in the next one. Peace.